Okay, so we pick up on the final of our grand themes here, which is social cognition. And we're going to start off by addressing a very difficult problem. In order to keep our thinking straight, it helps for us not to think about everything all at once.
Really? That's been my problem for the past 4 days in trying to write this essay.
Exactly. Exactly. So we like to say, okay, I'm going to deal with this first and just park that. This is a normal way that we do it. How the hell else could you deal with the complexity? Sometimes there's good reasons. So if we are, we might want to separate our discussion of politics from our discussion of football, for example. And hopefully you can keep them apart. But sometimes we're just, we're using this as a strategy for dealing with complexity, but we may be introducing distinctions that are not well maintained. So that's very abstract. Look, if we'll be concerned here with whether there is any kind of a distinction at all between the psychological and the social, even though we frequently, if we're discussing human behavior, we would say, oh, that's psychological, oh, that's social, and we would work up our stories and try to keep them separate. But this happens not just with the psychological and social. The biological and the cultural are two other domains that we cannot keep apart. We've been cultural for far longer than we've been Homo sapiens sapiens. That's worth remembering. So Homo sapiens is an animal that evolved in culture. And you can't keep, for some purposes, it's convenient to treat these as if they were distinct. And it's also not clear how you can have a conversation in which we can coherently discuss Wagnerian opera and mitosis, to take a cultural and a biological topic directly. I don't think it would be an interesting conversation to manage to link those two. But in many cases, and in particular as we're coming into looking at our social nature, both of these distinctions are in trouble. They both suggest that the world splits up in ways that are not really justified. It may be appropriate for some discussions, but we want to be cautious here. In very many cases, if you treat the psychological and the social and the biological and the cultural as radically distinct, as domains, one type of explanation there, a different type of explanation there, then typically what you're doing is you're trying to isolate man from nature. No, not man. Man, from nature. So a distinction between the biological and cultural, this is nature, and this is just stuff we do, right? This psychological, social is a different kind of distinction. So these are different issues. And I'm not suggesting that there's anything wrong in having such distinctions. We need them. My God, we need to be able to talk about biology. We need to be able to talk about social life. We need to be able to talk about psychology. We need these distinctions. But in many respects, they are artificial. And by leaning on them too much, we may introduce problems. Now, our psychological theories typically describe the mind of an individual. This is Rodin's The Thinker, the Penseur. This is the classic psychological subject in his own head, right? These are classical psychological subjects. And typically when we frame an account in this way, we've drawn this box here. The subject is inside the box and the world is outside the box. And a lot of constructive psychological theories trying to fill the box on the basis of, for example, sensation. And this, as I've drawn it here, is the linear throughput model that has perception, cognition, action. You can reconfigure that box in very many ways. So my point is simply that this is atomistic. It takes the individual to be an atom, a monad, something which is separate from everything else. You say, but I am separate from everything else. Well, you little solipsist, you. It's very difficult to maintain that insistence that you are separate from everything else. We're verging into religious ground here. Caution, let's back away, okay? Let's back away. Let's just note that different approaches within cognitive science will take different views with respect to how we cash out the notion of an individual, how we attribute responsibility to something, whether the responsibility for an action belongs with an individual or with sets of relata or processes or with multiple people. And we're going to distinguish two large schools, as we have done several times. We've got the information processing world, representationalist accounts, and we're going to have something like embodied post-cognitive accounts over here, and they differ hugely with respect to the relationship between an individual and their world. Here, this is sort of the picture we arrive at when we start with Descartes' skepticism, throw in a little bit of Kant's sophistry and sophistication, and we end up with a subject who represents the world to themselves, and what the nervous system is doing is constructing a representation of the world which will allow this. So this subject is very much in their own heads. And that's the story of a lot of representational cognitive science. And the embodied school typically tries to eschew representations and emphasize instead the dense interconnection of everything and the fact that any given subject is completely immersed in context and is uninterpretable in the absence of that context. But these stories are not as well fleshed out as those. And this is sort of where a lot of the contention exists within contemporary cognitive science. What I'm simply pointing out is that the relationship between the individual and the environment is one such fracture line where different styles of explanation will come up with radically different stories. And when I speak of environment, I want to come back to your point, Jenny, and I want to be cautious with that word. We're not talking like this. When we say environments, people, you start to think, oh, tropical rainforest, desert, mountain peak, and so on. That's not what we're talking about. Your environment looks like this. Right? You all know what that is? That's, yeah. The physical surfaces have been engineered to be unproblematic. The ground you walk on is flat. It's not even got lumpy bumps. And if there's going to be a lumpy bump, it's got big, bright tape on it saying, warning, step. When you approach an obstacle down there and you want to actually go through the obstacle, someone fashioned a thing called a handle. They put it on it, so you just have to reach out. The world is simple from a physical point of view for us, and we live nearly all our lives in these engineered environments which reduce the physical challenges of getting around to virtually nil. Have you ever been in the jungle? If you ever walk through a jungle, you realize what a different kind of environment it is. You have to be completely connected to your environment if you're walking through a jungle. You can't just march, right? You get eaten alive in the jungle if you don't treat it with the appropriate respect. So you feel, and if you're walking through the jungle, that takes up all your space. You're not going to be whistling Dixie. You're going to be paying attention. But walking across campus here is very, very easy. There are challenging elements in that environment. They're the other people. The other people are by far the most interesting, challenging, and important element in that environment. It's not the steps and it's not the weather. So the most important element in the environment of a human being is usually other human beings. Now there are exceptions. Some people live in caves as isolates, as hermits. But even they come from families and traditions where principally we act together in the world. And this brings with it a whole bunch of questions about how do we interrelate, how do we approach our social nature. And these questions, there's a lot of them. They travel more or less under the flag of intersubjectivity. That is, there's lots of elements to our beings that you need more than one person to even acknowledge. So language, for example, is something which is inherently intersubjective. There's no such thing as language if you're the only person in the universe. It wouldn't make any sense. Language is necessarily intersubjective. Perhaps we're figuring out other people. Perhaps we prefer solipsistic accounts. Solipsism. Solipsism is the view, you're the only one that exists in the world. You have no direct knowledge of my consciousness. There's a pain there, but you can't feel it. I'm telling you there's a pain there. But your pain, you can feel that. So the only thing you've actually evidence for is that you exist.
Okay.
That's a solipsism. It's a logical dead end. Nobody wants to be a solipsist. But the Cartesian skepticism is a great way of making that seem like a reasonable account, even though no one wants to end there. It's a problem. Empathy, we noted as we were discussing mirror neurons that there's a great deal of interest in trying to figure out how we mind read other people, how we act in awareness of their concerns. And this is my favorite one, and I don't think that this question has been posed sufficiently directly. We live in a common world. We share a world in a way I think very many other inhabitants of the earth don't. But I don't know. Psychologists and sociologists have fought over the territory for the explanation of human activity for over 100 years. There are sociologists who reject any form of psychological explanation. There are psychologists who don't believe in anything, in granting reality to anything social. Margaret Thatcher was playing the psychologist's card when she said, there's no such thing as society. There's just people. And families, she went on to say, because that suited her political narrative. It made complete nonsense of her argument, but it suited her political narrative. Here's a little example of something from a little video put together in 1944 from Haider and Simmel. I just want to see, what do you see here? You have to fill in the music yourself. A little epic story involving two triangles and a circle. Was anyone unmoved by that? You saw the bullying, you saw the seduction, you saw the anger at the end, you saw the joy at getting an escape, all from a bunch of triangles and circles. We're clearly very good at reading something intentionally, reading it as if the things we're looking at had little lives of their own. I assure you those were not sentient circles and triangles, right? But we're capable of attributing complex mental lives to such simple things. And that is done from research in the 1940s. But it addresses questions that we certainly still don't have a good handle on. We're not sure how we should think about knowing others. That's the big question, I suppose, that occupies sociologists, psychologists, and social psychologists who sit at this uneasy juncture. My feeling is that these concerns are among the least well articulated in the whole of cognitive science. So I don't think anyone has a particularly good story here, but everyone sees the need for it. Some terms of art that are useful for us to use are these. We speak of first-person stance, third-person stance. Is everybody clear what those terms mean? You see the world from a first-person point of view, or you see something from a first-person point of view, or from a third person. Is that clear to you what they mean?
Could we have an example?
Yeah. These are difficult terms. They come from the study of grammar. I is the first person, you is the second person, he, she, or it is the third person. So the first person stance is what it's like to be me. And the third person stance is what you had with respect to those triangles. Okay? You're looking at them very much from the outside, from a remove. The third person stance is not the same thing as a God's eye view. And that's very important. Nobody has the view from nowhere. The third person stance is someone else's first person stance. So we speak, or these terms are wielded very often as if they were very clearly distinct. And the third person stance is the objective account, and the first person stance is the subjective account. And that simple distinction between objective and subjective is not sustainable. That one you need to pay great attention to. There's been a lot of talk about expanding this language to include a second person stance, and nobody seems to quite agree on what a second person stance is. You're sitting there going, what's a second person stance? Because you're thinking of the distinction between the first person stance and the third person stance as being largely differences in camera position. If the camera is behind my eyes and looking out, that's first person stance, and if it's up there as a fly on the wall, that's the third person. How could you have a second person stance? But these are not meant to refer to camera positions, and what it is like to be me is not to be a camera behind my eyes looking out like this. The third person stance is not the simple fly on the wall camera. The point of a second person stance is to articulate a position that we are in when we are interacting with each other. When everything that I say and do is affected by what you say and do and be and are. When we are co-being. When we can no longer be regarded as entirely distinct from one another. And this is the question, this is where the really hard questions arise. To what extent are we distinct from one another? There's a very interesting article in Behavioral and Brain Sciences in 2013 called Towards a Second Person Neuroscience. It was the one that coined that phrase, the dark matter of neuroscience might be social interaction. Have you met Behavioral and Brain Sciences? It's a very interesting journal that has a very unique form of discussion. There's a large 30-40 page article, and then there's comments by up to about 50 different people who are responding to this article. So they write short comments, and then the authors respond again to the collective of responses to their original paper. So the whole thing becomes a very useful way of capturing not just a claim, but a conversation. And so these are very often landmark articles. And this is quite an interesting one. I'm not sure it entirely works. This is a figure from it where it tries to distinguish between different kinds of social interaction, distinguishing between whether there's interaction, but also whether there's emotional engagement. So the time in each case here goes from top to bottom. We'll just look at these things in the middle. Time goes from top to bottom. In this case, there's an actor and a passive observer. So the flow is just from the actor to the passive observer. This is an engaged observer where the flow is still the same. So this is like spectator view of this observer. Like the observer watching the actor, but also responding. So these vertical arrows mean that there's emotional engagement. Here we've got reciprocal interaction, but without emotional engagement. And here we've got reciprocal interaction with fully emotional engagement. So I had a actually very emotional scene with a parking system when I arrived here this morning when I was trying to text in numbers on a credit card in the rain when everything's falling around, and it's horrible. It was that kind of reaction because the person on the other end was not responding to me at all. We were conducting our interaction, but we weren't mutually emotionally engaged, shall we say. Whereas we all here now are mutually, this is us. Now this is an attempt to take the terms and concepts of cognitive neuroscience and use them to flesh out this field. May or may not be possible, I don't know. I'm just pointing you towards it. Nobody quite knows how to do this. There are three major approaches to intersubjectivity, which are landmarks, and we need to know all three. But the job is still very, very much undone. We haven't got far here, and we're still developing our basic concepts. The Heider and Simmel work you saw comes from an early attempt, so we're talking a middle 20th century attempt, to articulate a scientific story, social psychological story, of how we come to perceive intentions in others, how we can even look at a little triangle and attribute to it a world of dreams, aspirations, hopes, and ambitions, and emotions. There was joy and anger and stuff in those little triangles and circles. That was the original approach that goes by the name of theory theory, and it arose in the middle of the 20th century. It wasn't until about the 1980s that it got some competition from something called simulation theory. And simulation theory would have probably settled down to a relatively low level, but then in the 90s we had mirror neurons and all the jive around those, which we just looked at, so that drove simulation theory through the roof. So don't believe that theories get replaced. They don't. A good theory never goes away. So you might hate theory and be all on board with simulation theory, but it's not going to stop other people pursuing theory. And the more recent kid on the block since about 10 years ago is something called participatory sensemaking, which we'll get to as well. It's increasingly becoming a coherent, well fleshed out alternative to these with some rather different characteristics. So there are the three approaches we take. They're situated historically in that sequence. And like I say, they coexist and will continue to coexist. So we kind of need to know them all. Theory starts with a general view of how we figure stuff out, how we figure complex stuff out. There were perceived shortcomings from category theory. Category theory is long established as a very central part of psychology, individual psychology, and category theory provides an account of how we impose some kind of order on a whole host of variation that we encounter in the world. So we come to recognize things as different representatives of a common class, for example. So there's multiple trees out there, they all look very, very different, but I can deal with this complexity because I have the concept of tree. Developmental theory also tries to show how we come to master some of the complexity of the world. When we walked through Piaget, for example, we noted the staged development by which we went from a sensory motor engaged concrete form of being in the present to highly abstract reified intellectual thought. Those are also means of overcoming complexity in the world, but none of them seem to be sufficient to account for this kind of willful, almost promiscuous psychologizing we do when we look at something like the Heider and Simmel cartoon and start attributing willy-nilly beliefs, desires, intentions, emotions, and so on. So we seem to be far more creative here than either of these kinds of approaches will allow us. And we seem to do it all the time. Young kids, of course, attribute all kinds of fanciful emotions and intentions to their toys, dolls, to everything in the world. The world is full of things to which you can do this. But even grown adults, I mean, we're still doing it here. So theory suggests that we deal with complexity by sort of, like, as if we were proto-scientists. So we develop an internal account for ourselves, and that would be a theory of how people behave. So, now this is not scientists, but this is everybody, the suggestion is, so that they just make more sense if we attribute things like beliefs and so on to them. I make more sense to you if I go, ow, when I hit my thumb with a hammer. If I hit my thumb with a hammer and start singing, you're going to be perplexed. I'm going to be a lot more intelligible to you if I act as if I had beliefs and desires and intentions. Beliefs, desires, and intentions is this collective vocabulary of intentionality in which a lot of historically, a lot of philosophy of mind has dealt. And it comes to the fore here in theory. These are the kinds of things that we need in order to make sense of others. There's no undue reification, I don't think. I don't think this theory would be committed to finding, for example, a neural basis for a belief, which would be very problematic, because no one's ever found anything like that. We wouldn't even know what that means. It's just saying that, other people make more sense to me if I treat them as if they were driven by beliefs, desires, and intentions. This approach has been extended famously in this Primack and Woodruff article. Does a chimpanzee have a theory of mind? Again, in Behavioral and Brain Sciences. A very interesting article in which this approach, which had been well developed for humans from the 1940s and 50s, is suddenly turned on others. So you then do things like, can you find experimental situations in which the actions of a chimpanzee make more sense if they were attributing belief states to someone else? So these kind of false belief tasks that we do with children where we hide things and then go out of the room and then switch the location. You can creatively come up with those and you can do them on chimpanzees. And you can start to build up a story that chimpanzees, our nearest neighbors, also have some kind of ability to develop an inner theory that helps them deal with the complexity of the other. So these theories are not scientific theories. The idea is that this is a strategy used, that's why we talk about folk psychology, a strategy used by everyone to make sense of everyone else. They make more sense, like good luck making sense of anything recently. Huh? Sorry, real world sneaks in. Theory has been very, very influential. As I said, just because there's other kids on the block doesn't mean that this one goes away. And it's probably the basis for the most influential theories of autism. Simon Baron-Cohen is the brother of Ali G. Sacha Baron-Cohen.
Mm-hmm.
So,
oh, right.
Yeah, you all know, Borat
Yeah.
and the Mankini. His brother, Simon Baron-Cohen, is an expert in study of autism, and the idea here is that autistic individuals make more sense to us if we think of them as not being very good at doing this kind of attribution. Indeed, many of you will know, if you've had any experience of dealing with people who are on the autistic spectrum, they very often have to be told what facial expressions mean. They have to practice and learn that smile is not anger, and that is anger. And some things that seem to come naturally to most of us do not come naturally to them. And a powerful account can be built up in which they are described as having a less than wonderful ability to project these kinds of attributions on others. In fact, here's the false belief task I was talking about. You all seem to be familiar with this. You can do this with kids very easily, of course, but as I said, with creative elaboration, you can do something like this even with chimpanzees. So Sally has a marble, puts the marble in the basket, Sally goes out and moves the marble. Now Sally comes back. Where is the marble? There is an important point between about 3 to 4 where the abstract and kids give to this changes from the basket to the box. From the box to the basket. If you attribute it to the basket, your reasoning seems to include a knowledge state of Sally. Sally knew the marble was in the basket when she went out. Then she comes back. If you say she's going to look in the basket, which I think is quite probably where she's going to look, then your reasoning involves the attribution of a belief to Sally. If you're not doing that, then you just go, well, the marble's in the box. That's where, of course, that's where she's going to live. A well-designed test like this has legs. This one's been around for donkey's years. It doesn't serve to flesh out the theory approach to social interaction, but it's a very useful anchor, so you can see why this kind of approach works to account for some things. And theory has been elaborated over the years. You can take this kind of proclivity, the tendency to attribute beliefs and desires and intentions and emotions and so on to other people, and you can suggest that that's how you come to know about yourself as well. This has been a very influential account of self-knowledge, that you have no privileged access to yourself, but you sort of infer. In the same way that you infer about other people, you infer from yourself what it is that you believe, intend, and so on. Controversial stuff. Not everyone's happy with it. It's an interesting move to make, to suggest that you have to figure yourself out, as opposed to just knowing everything that's going on. I don't know how you feel about that. But, so theory provides you with a vocabulary and a set of concepts with which you can come at some aspects of our social being, development, and pathology. So that's useful. And then in the 1980s, came simulation theory. And this was developed explicitly as an alternative to theory. Because theory is also a bit clunky, and it leaves you with these ill-defined words like beliefs, desires, and intentions, which we haven't actually defined at all. It's just that the language that we were using for talking about other people anyway seems to work in our theory. Simulation theory suggests that we do something different. That is, when I see you in a perplexed state, that I can understand your perplexity because I myself have been perplexed in the past, and I can mentally simulate your situation. I can put myself in your shoes, as it were. This has been part of the computational theory of mind, and it relies on some assumptions of the computational theory of mind. The idea is that in the course of my life, I have often been perplexed. I've often found myself in situations when I am perplexed. As a result, I can understand not only my own perplexity, but other people's perplexity by sort of simulating that offline. Because I've been there before, I can rerun those experiences and so come to know what it is to be perplexed for someone else to be perplexed. Al Goldman is the principal architect of simulation theory. It's very tied to this computational account in a way that theory isn't. Of course, theory is also older. It predates the big rush to computational theorizing. I think as computers and computer metaphor was becoming more embedded within cognitive science, and people were starting to think computationally, simulation became an obvious thing to try out. We use computers to simulate all the time. All our weather forecasting is done by simulating. Our climate models simulate. So if you're thinking of the brain as a computer, simulation seems to be a natural kind of thing that it might do. And it allows us to tentatively move towards this business of sharing a world. Because I can only simulate your experiences crudely, but you are a bipedal, humanoid person coming from a kind of a society and a background that is hopefully somewhat intelligible to me. By virtue of the fact that we have some shared being in the world, we share similar bodies, we share similar backgrounds, to that extent, I can put myself in your shoes, as it were. I think this was going nowhere. But then mirror neurons came around and it all went batshit crazy. the mirror neurons fitted this account perfectly. And where previously you'd had a couple of dozen researchers trying this out to develop alternatives to the theory, folk psychological theorizing that dominated accounts, simulation theory was a brave effort, but mirror neurons seemed to be an implementation mechanism for this. I can't even make the slightest sense of that, I'm afraid. Lots of people seem to think of them. If you think back to this mythical scene in the lab at night, postdoc, the monkey has been known to reach for peanuts, and we know that this every time the monkey reaches for a peanut, the neuron fires. And now the postdoc reaches for a peanut and the neuron fires. This seems to be a means of comprehending. It looks like the monkey is understanding the intentions of the other. Recall as well that these mirror neurons were sensitive to goal-directed actions. It's not simply the shape of the movement, it's the intention behind it. That's what sets people off here. That's why the mirror neuron thing became so popular and why it supported such creative generalizations, I suppose. Both of these theories coexist, and there are hybrids. Anytime you get two opposing things, someone's going to come up and try to do the middle way thing. So, for example, low-level automatic mirroring with high-level theory. So, trying to separate lower processes of cognition from higher. So, the strategy some people seem to favor. So, this would be intellectually figuring stuff out, but this would be more like subconsciously imitating, subconsciously adopting a perspective similar to that of the other. Simulation theory and theory, however, both have one thing in common. They both distinguish between the psychological domain and the social domain. They distinguish clearly between the psychological domain and the social domain. In each case, it's me figuring out you, and you figuring out me. The me and the you are the poles here. And that has been criticized by others as being beholden to a philosophical problem, which we might describe as Cartesianism or solipsism. Here it comes again. Solipsism is really important today because what we're doing is we're encountering the limits of any attempt to explain individuals as separable entities in the natural world. When we deal with social interaction, the interaction has a reality that demands our attention as well. It's one thing to say, I'm recognizing you and you're recognizing me. It's quite another if we interact, then the interaction itself has aspects to it that cannot be simply broken apart and stuffed into one head or into the other head. Both simulation theory and theory adopt this kind of problem. So we started off with being John Malkovich. Remember that one? You find yourself behind the eyes of John Malkovich and hardly, but sort of ineptly able to control his body. Hitchcock's Rear Window is another really great reference point for this. If you haven't seen Rear Window, is it James Cagney? No, James Stewart, sorry. James Stewart has a broken leg. And he's immobile, and he's stuck there, and he also has a massive telephoto lens on his camera, and he's overlooking this courtyard, looking out at, basically spying on other people looking in their windows, and he sees all kinds of terrible things. I won't spoil the movie for you, but a lot of the plot revolves around the fact that he has a fixed immobile position from which to view things. So he can't interact at all with what's going on. He can't affect what's going on, he can only observe it. So, simulation theory and theory have the longer histories. The new boy on the block, participatory sense-making, is not something that we have a great background for in this course yet. This is something we will be introducing in my topics course that I teach in the second semester. It comes from one kind of embodied approach to cognitive science, which is gaining a lot of traction. And that's the mind and life approach, in which many of the things that we have hitherto ascribed to nervous systems are attributed, in this approach, to the processes of living, more generally. This is the kind of approach I take, and that's why I continually refer to the brain as meat, because on this approach, the brain is meat. It's not magic. And cognition is a way of talking about interactions between various kinds of autonomous agents and their environments. The model of an interaction here is the handshake, rather than the button push. So theory, and simulation theory are both cases in which I'm distinct from you. So I do something and you respond, and you do something and I respond. It's a separatedness that you don't find in a handshake. The handshake is a very different model. A handshake doesn't decompose. You can't separate the handshake. If you ever shaken the hand of a robot, you'll know what I'm talking about, because a robot handshake will do this. And there's not a person on the other end, and it's not going to sensitively and reciprocally respond to you. We don't have the necessary background to elaborate greatly on this. But, just to give you some terms, a lot of the time we've run into the limitations, the strengths and limitations of looking at input-output models of the person. So there's the person, there's perception in, there's thinking, cognition, and there's action out. And this separates the person from their world completely. In an active approach, any given system, and the person is one kind of system, but this approach works for a cell as well, is inseparable from its environment, shown here using this wavy line. In fact, it remains what it is only by processes of regulated interaction with its environment, a process known as sense-making. So sense-making is a generic term that covers much of what we mean by perception and action in competing approaches. And sense-making is this activity of a system in keeping itself going as a system. So when a single cell exchanges nutrients and waste products with its environment, all that activity serves to preserve the identity of the cell. If it doesn't consume and get rid of waste products, it will die. The cell itself is not to be identified with any particular material, because you can exchange every single atom from the cell and still have the same cell. Do you know the ship of Theseus problem from philosophy? So Theseus goes and has all these adventures and comes home, and there's this ship. And it's a wonderful ship, and we've got all this history behind it. And we stick it up there. And then somebody somewhere notices, oh, look, this plank could really do with renewing. So you take out the old plank and you stick in a nice new plank, but you take the old plank and you put it over here. And over the years, different parts of the ship need renewing. And you renew them, but you reassemble it over here. And after a while, you've got to ask yourself, hang on, we've actually exchanged every single plank in the ship. Is this still Theseus' ship, or is the one that I assembled from the ones that we replaced? Which one is Theseus' ship now? Same problem applies to you. Every single atom in your body will be replaced in the course of your life. So you can't be identified with the material, with the matter itself, with the atoms don't have identities. Rather, your identity lies in the processes that work together to keep your body going. So on this view, we're interested in systems, in activities, in processes. And sense-making is the activity, the interaction, regulated interaction with the environment that allows you to persist. That's the basic starting point from an action. And what happens then is interesting if you have two systems and they form part of each other's environment. Because my sense-making that keeps me going becomes caught up with your sense-making that keeps you going. And all our sense-making activities become caught up and entangled with each other, so they are no longer separable. This is the notion of participatory sense-making. There's an example, this is a caricature example, but it helps because this is a little bit tricky to get. There's a caricature example which you're all familiar with, so we'll exaggerate it. Two people meet in a corridor, and they want to get past each other. So they both accidentally go to this side. Whoops, now they both go to this side. Whoops. And you can do this dance for a surprisingly long time. While they're engaged in that interaction, the interaction has kind of taken control of them. The interaction has a reality which is distinct from the goals of either participant. They both want to get out of it. And I mean, in real life, we actually resolve this rather more quickly. But the thing that keeps the joint activity has a reality which is can't be captured by describing the actions and beliefs, desires, and intentions of this person and the actions, beliefs, desires, and intentions of this person. We need to acknowledge the reality of the interaction itself. The suggestion is that in this way we come to occupy a shared world through long, long historical processes of mutual interaction which have kept us all going, as it were. We're only taking a peek at this. We'll come back, we'll revisit this topic in the next semester. So I'm going to finish up with just a nice analogy for thinking about this, because we've mentioned Descartes and we've mentioned solipsism several times today, and we need to get our heads straight around this. Everybody is sure that they exist. Is anybody here not existing? Put your hand up if you don't exist. All right, no hands went up. Everybody's happy that they exist. That's not necessarily the same thing as you being distinct from everything else, though. As you being separate from everything else. And I rather like this soap. Sorry for the music. Now, the square soap bubble is a distinguishable entity. There's no philosophical problem with identifying the square soap bubble and distinguishing it from everything else. We're all clear on that? At the same time, there is no part of that square soap bubble that is separable from everything else. Every single part of that co-arises with everything else. It's just a visual metaphor. But it helps a lot in resolving some of the anxiety that arises when we either accept or reject the Cartesian model. Descartes, you remember, insists, I exist, I exist, I exist, and then I'm going out into the world. Right?
But only while I'm thinking.
Only while, oh yeah. Yeah, so actually it's the speaking that brings that to
me. Right, that, yeah.
Very, very, very good point. My favorite.
I just reread that.
But if you think you have your mind and your mind is separate from everything else, then you're sort of recognizing the distinguishability of a domain and failing to recognize the degree to which that is only possible because it co-arises with everything else. These are difficult, but this is a rich set of images with which we can, hopefully in the next semester anyway, approach some of these venerable problems such as social interaction. So the participatory sense-making story is not atomistic. It's not how do I come and figure you out, how do you come and figure me out. Participatory sense-making is how do our long history, millennia of reciprocal interactions give rise to a shared world that we both inhabit. Quite different. But we'll stop there for today.